Assalamu alaikum, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Welcome everybody, greetings to all of you. We're very honored tonight to have Dr. Eva Brann with us. Dr. Brann is, I think, it's quite acceptable to say, a very brilliant scholar, writer, and has been a professor for 60 years at St. John's College, teaching what's known in the West as the canon of the great works in Western civilization. She's taught everything from Ptolemy's book on astronomy to the Platonic dialogues, political philosophy, Aristotle's politics, and many other things. She's also written on some very interesting subjects that are not really thought about very often. She's written on feelings. She's written on the idea of negation, the philosophical concept of negation. And she has a book that we have available in the bookstore for people that are interested on the paradoxes of education in a republic, which looks at three broad paradoxes of education in a republic and other aspects, other paradoxical aspects of education. But I think for us here at Zaytuna and for people that are familiar with what we're doing here, we have a lot of the students are here tonight and many of the faculty, but we also have some guests that are warmly welcome. The idea of teaching great works is something that would have been simply not even discussed even 100 years ago or 200 years ago in most places. And now many of these works are seen as things that need to be set aside, or that we don't need the kind of Western hegemonic discourse that has created and wreaked such havoc on the world. So there's actually a lot of places now that want to eliminate the canon from education. I think one of the tragedies of that is many of the people that wrote in the canon were actually persecuted in their lifetimes. So they were certainly, we have a unfortunate saying in America that goes back to the 19th century Indian Wars: the only good Indian is a dead Indian. And in many ways, the only good author of a great book is a dead author of a great book. I think there's a lot of similarities to that. So these people tend to be accepted long after they're gone. Malcolm X gets a postage stamp by the government after he's vilified during his lifetime. So, having said that, she has an incredible knowledge of the canon and able to draw from it in her writings with great ease and adroitness. So we're very honored to have her at Zaytuna College. We're a fledgling college that is committed to the liberal arts, and hopefully we'll get into a discussion after the lecture about what are the liberal arts and what is a liberal education. And I think her lecture is going to address that also topic. So without further ado, we warmly welcome our esteemed scholar and sister, Dr. Eva Brann. So I'd like a hearty welcome here.
Thank you, Sheikh Hamza. Can you hear me? Okay. The title of this lecture is Liberal Education. Number one, a prelude for the undergraduates of Zaytuna College. When Sheikh Hamza did me the honor of inviting me to speak to you, he said that he wanted me to discourse plainly and definitively on liberal education. I was good and ready, since it's been a decade since I've tried my hand at doing that. What you're about to hear consists of a blunt list of general characteristics of liberal education as I think of it. A second part goes into detail of a particular version. I mean, what we do in our program at St. John's College, where I've been a tutor for 60 years. To us, the fact that we avoid calling ourselves professor is significant. We don't claim to be professing authoritatively anything, but only to protect. Tutor is the Latin word for guardian, so only to protect our students' learning. I'm hoping my talk will affect you in this way. Some of my general characteristics you may agree with. As small great books colleges, my school and yours are, after all, twins, though by no means identical twins, for we differ in a huge element. Despite the name of St. John's College, we are a secular institution, while you, in every classroom, supplicate Allah to further your studies. As for the particular version of liberal education that my school actualizes, you, who are experts in a different way, may strongly disagree with. For example, to prepare for my visit, I read some of the writings about Zaytuna. For instance, I found very helpful an expedition of your dean, Dr. Delp, on the teaching of the liberal arts at your school. He makes a strong case for the high value of a good lecture. We, on the other hand, have one lecture at most a week. I'm myself no believer in lecturing, even as I sit here. I'm doing it, and yet I have a slightly bad conscience. My suspicion is that these different opinions of the lecture as a teaching tool have deep roots in our different frameworks. Yours one of faith, ours of non-commitment. I'm hoping you'll tell me in our question period what you think about this by no means trifling issue. My suspicion is, but I could be wrong, that our respective student types, I mean as students, not as human beings, turn out to be somewhat different in this respect. You might be more respectful toward your books and your teachers, and ours might be somewhat freer. My experience in the years when I was dean would point that way. My door was always open, and quite often students would march in full of complaint against their tutor. Ms. Brann, he dominates, they'd say. He does all the talking, etc., etc. Well, I'd say, invite him to lunch in the dining hall and talk to him. They'd be back. He hasn't changed. Then, and this was my least favorite activity, I'd call him in. But they don't know what they're talking about, and often they're not even prepared, he'd say. Then I'd say, better they should flounder on their own than repeat the truth after you. You may strongly disagree with this pedagogic sentiment, and I'll be interested to hear your side. I've read pitifully little in the Islamic tradition of great books, but I have read al-Ghazali's Path to Sufism. He is, it seems, your guardian saint, to use a somewhat inappropriate figure of speech. So I know that it is part of your studies here to recognize, as he does, explicitly, the problem in the very claim I made to the talkative tutor. How do we come to choose our authority? I'll tell you how I came to know of al-Ghazali. Zaytuna and St. John's have two students in common. John Ruppelus graduated from St. John's, went to Zaytuna for a second degree, and became a Muslim. Aisha Darab graduated from Zaytuna, married John, and came to St. John's, where she's just received her master's degree. I was her advisor on her thesis, a fine piece of philosophical inquiry. Just last month, she had her public examination, in which she did heroically. After this oral, I took them out for a celebratory lunch. Being married, they melded their library, consisting largely of Islamic classics. At this lunch, they surprised me with a gift, a large book bag full of your texts, the ones they had two of. So I'm the proud owner of a shelf of great books from our sister tradition, books I expect to read my way into, heavy on al-Ghazali. So now, down to business. And number 2, here is a preliminary description of liberal education in PowerPoints. First point, liberal education is not a professional performance of authorities highly trained in graduate or professional schools, but slightly engaged in spectatorship. It is rather a participatory activity in which learners on various levels, made effectively equal under the aspect of the magnitude of the task, together achieve a sort of intimate distance with each other. Intimate in the closeness of the cooperation, distant by the exclusion of improper invasions of privacy. Teaching affects the intellect, it does not finger the soul. On the day of graduation, the student-tutor connection becomes a lifelong friendship. In this relation of student to student, student to teacher, teacher to teacher, the permissible competition is only self-competition. It follows that schools should be small. Bigness draws down quantification, and this measuring disfigures the soul. 2, the characteristic frame of mind befitting liberal education is what I call reverent radicality, deep respect and penetrating questions. It is a serious mistake to present liberal education as preoccupied with questioning, a surreptitiously skewering aggression on the very way things are. Questions may indeed sometimes dissipate prejudices, but they are as likely to clarify and so to confirm a heritage. A real radical is one who goes to the roots, digs them up, often more for secure reburial, and having examined them in the light of reason rather than the murk of rationalization. Parents who find their children's liberal interlude, parents who fund their children's liberal interlude may indeed get them back alienated. But if it was a genuine education, they will find them more sympathetic in the long run. 3, liberal education is costly. It requires leisure. Here's a fact to make you smile. The word that gives us school, skole in Greek, signifies leisure. It requires tutors, the guardians of this learning, to whom their vocation is not only their life, but also a living. Consequently, the night of a child's conception should be followed that morning with a first small investment in this guarded leisure activity. 4, the prime object, its be-all and end-all, is happiness. All else is unintended, the hoped-for consequence. The less intended, the more likely to eventuate. It is emphatically neither to teach students to think, a patent impossibility, nor to make them productive citizens, a dangerous wish until you know what they'll produce. Much righteous defense of non-vocational education is, if you'll forgive me, drivel, and people who have its future at heart should come clean. So once more, the 4 years conventionally assigned to such education should themselves be gloriously happy, always remembering that true happiness requires the heightening delimitation of occasional agony, confusion, and even despair. In fact, happiness as a pursuit is specifically American, an unalienable right, meaning not an anxious chase, but a steadily pursued activity. So says our declaration, which is Public Law number 1. Other ways to put this view of the aim of liberal education is that it is not a utility, a means, but is lived for its own sake. So liberal schooling must be a present experience of fulfillment and the acquisition of the unwearying habit of thoughtful happiness. 5, this mode of life needs concreteness. It is inherently non-virtual. Virtual, you may know, means inactual. That's the meaning of the word virtual. It requires a fixed place, the location. Call it the crystal bubble, in which its participants readily meet face to face. In fact, the decoding of human expression, the reading of faces and bodily gestures is part of a liberal education. Hence, distance learning is not compatible with a close-up experiential setting of a liberal education. The mode of togetherness fitting this education is conversation, not argument, debate, or discussion, but talking together, taking turns, which is what conversation literally means. Speaking and then listening. Domination, winning, does not fit, but there is room for self-respect and pride, such as comes from the mutual attention and admiration that we give each other. Excellence can mean being good or standing out. The way of liberal education is to emphasize inherent worth over comparative valuation. Number 6, some human works are best learned by doing. Improving worldly conditions is not among these. A time of receptive learning should precede active intervention. First shape yourself, then shape society. In particular, form views about what makes for human contentment, then interfere judiciously. The necessary acquisition of technical know-how should follow the stocking of the human soul's treasury with desirable goods. Soul, as you may know, is largely a proscribed term currently, but you can say subjectivity, consciousness, etc., whatever suits you, and let those who don't want a soul do without it. In brief, the learning matter of liberal education should be the lovable per se. 7, it is an immediate consequence that education should not be preoccupied with current evils and their eradication. The project requires political engagement and usually involves ideology. Ideology, prepackaged thinking, does not belong in a community of learning. Political philosophy, yes. Politics, no. The sure test is this: if people get hot under the collar, it's politics. If they become deeply interested, it's philosophy. The program of a liberal education should concentrate on works of great quality rather than of so-called relevance, with its thoroughly complicit instrument, namely information. Information is pure relativity. It gains its standing as knowledge relative to a prejudgment of purpose, and it preempts mentation, dislodging reflection. The works of highest worth used to be called classics, after a Roman ranking of social classes, the highest of which was classic simply. I prefer the adjective great, used with articulable specificity, as I will explain in a moment. The chief reason to adhering to atemporal greatness of quality over relevance to current conditions is that liberal learning should raise us out of ourselves. The Greek word for that condition is ecstasis. Such learning should be on occasion a soberly ecstatic experience. Third part. There are respectable alternatives to liberal education which help to delineate its proper conception. It cannot be a grab bag of choosable commodities, consumer-oriented knowledge produce, like a supermarket, many of whose advertised items are, however, usually out of stock. It is rather a coherent plan designed and maintained by a collegial faculty in devoted service, not to its own several careers, but to the program's survival. New members sign voluntarily onto a plan they have not themselves originated, but in which they have some faith. The faculty's attentive devotion, its ever-critical faith, is the essential human ground of such a program's maintenance. That and the backing of the administration, the agency that ministers to the plan. Beyond them stands the governing and supporting agency, its board. The broader requirement is that the plan should neither be too confiningly ideal for actual implementation, nor too permissively chaotic for holding its shape. In other words, what's wanted is sensible practicality in the service of high-reaching. People have to combine high purpose with common sense. As my professor at Yale taught me, these were his terms: pure principles and corrupt administration. There are, I think, quite a few possible patterns for programs of liberal education. But once adopted, the roiling distraction of curricular revision, driven largely by faculty members tired of actual learning and real teaching, is destructive. Let a plan, once instituted, gain some venerability and gather the gravity of accumulated experience. Some of these alternative plans are educational, but really illiberal. That is, they're intentionally doctrinaire. Some are liberal, but not very educational. That is, they're excessively permissive. But so as not to befuddle my account with refined combinations, let me offer 4 common variants which clarify the conception of true liberal education when distinguished from it. These 4 are: training, which is coaching for competent know-how; indoctrination, which is inculcation of an ideology; formation, molding of the soul to a faith; cultivation, which is acquisition of the liberal arts. This is the moment not to define my terms. Defining your terms is a vocabulary exercise with little intellectual resonance, but to sketch out the meaning of the phrase liberal education. Education, it is a commonplace to point out, is derived from the Latin duration indicating verb educare, to keep on leading out, presumably from the dark cave of ignorance. It is indeed an extended activity, 4 years in this country, devoted to learning by means of texts, traditions, and conceptions, years of absorbing systematically the treasures and the tragedies of one's civilization. Liberal qualifies this arduously exhilarating effort as being free-spirited. It is actually Aristotle's term. He writes in the Politics, the word nut for free, which is eleutheron, liber in Latin, meaning education for the sons of non-slaves, but he writes in a free mode, liberalis. The difference is but an I, an iota, a jot, but is full of meaning. This education, the education, not its beneficiary, is adjectively free. It is carried on in a free spirit, neither constrained by utility nor by ideology. So liberal education is inherently not a kind of training for practical use, which results in competent know-how and is best done by apprenticeship and practical applications. Indeed, competence, qualified capability, is not a remarkably frequent result of being liberally educated. A friend of my college, whose admiration for our ways was not wholehearted, used to say that Johnnies, our students, come knowing nothing and leave knowing that they know nothing. It was a huge compliment, though not so intended. A clear apprehension of our limits is a very accurate sort of knowledge. Self-knowledge is surely one aim of liberal education. Nor is liberal education indoctrination with a set of opinions, because that is the very opposite of free-spiritedness, of flexibility with respect to our own opinions. Free-spiritedly educated people do not have a mindset, but mind mobility. Re-examination is ever possible. However, as I said before, this freedom of mental motion does not mean that nothing is ever to be unreservedly approved. What Auden, the poet Auden, demands of a poet, we may expect from good schooling. He says, in the present of his days, teach the free man how to praise. That's from the poem In Memory of W.B. Yeats. The notion that liberal education is necessarily subversive is not only false, but somewhat dangerous, because it divorces what should be acknowledged as everybody's good from popular feeling. Moreover, it is best, I think, to be boldly honest about our ignorance concerning the true causes of outcomes. Was it the 4 years of schooling that this school gave you, or was it mere life gone by that made one student this and another that? On graduation day, our students gratefully claim that we did it. I can but wish. Then finally, there's faith-based education, and it can be liberal. Colleges that are both formative in faith and seriously liberal in the sense of free inquiry are rare. I know of some Christian colleges for fundamentalism, of Thomas Aquinas College for Catholicism, and recently your own Zaytuna College for Islam. Such schools pose the most intellectually engaging questions for themselves and for the sympathetic outsider. What does it mean for inquiry to start from a ground postulating truths of faith and to reach a ceiling on open question asking? What or who bestows authority in doctrine, and how does a layperson discern it? What does it mean to believe in the divinity through a human intermediary, be it written scripture or human prophet? Not to be seized by these issues betokens a lack of seriousness about the question asking that is the beating heart of liberal education. Thus, the existence of faith-based schools protected in America's Constitution should be regarded as a blessing to the secular schools that deal with these particular problems of interpretation, but only do so occasionally, when the reading assigned is the sacred book of any faith. So now finally to the distinction between liberal education and the liberal arts. Whereas liberal education is a mode of learning, the liberal arts are the skills of learning. Their enumeration comes to us from Roman and medieval writers. Thus, arts were regarded as the preparation for the study of philosophy and theology. The distinction between these finalities diminishes when we consider that the grand philosophical systems, Plato's, Aristotle's, Kant's, Hegel's, all culminate in some form of divinity, while the great theologies, such as Augustine's and Thomas's, affirm that faith seeks understanding. In contemporary liberal arts colleges, the term is used loosely. It means mostly scholarship in the humanities. Human studies are, of course, what the liberal arts were precisely not, being in the service of divinity. Moreover, the humanities nowadays exclude mathematics and science. While these formed the major part of the medieval arts, so the term liberal arts is now untethered from its more cosmic origins. For the account of the liberal arts as a major part of liberal learning, I shall draw, as I said, on my own 80 years as a tutor at St. John's College, which has revived and adapted this learning matter as you have. So number 4, the liberal arts are the proper preparation for the liberal way of learning. The tradition counts 7 liberal arts. Arts because they're skills not to be entirely captured in formalisms, methods, and rules for the direction of the mind, but they require spontaneity and ingenuity. The first set of 3, the so-called Trivium, consists of grammar, rhetoric, and logic. These arts are thus concerned with the skills of mentation and of its language. Their unfortunate decline is captured in the current meaning of trivial, that is, insignificant. Grammar includes everything from syntax, which is the correct connection of words into sentences that propose a thought, to the composition of sentences into paragraphs that connects thoughts, and these into whole works that expound at large, down to punctuation, which might be called the gestures of writing, plus etymology, which uncovers what a word meant before use rubbed out its origin. Rhetoric is the art of using language seductively so as to persuade a listener that something, perhaps even something true, is being said, be it by means of an aggressively appealing style or of artful lying. Logic, finally, is the art of apprehending and applying the rules by which we compel thinking into definite courses, or perhaps by which thinking compels us to proceed in these courses. It is also the skill of dealing with symbols and with signs stripped of natural verbal connotations, having bare, strictly assigned meanings. The Trivium has its own pedagogy, more conventional than the ways of teaching that befit liberal education. It is pursued with us in something we call the language tutorial. In the language tutorial, a certain learnedness on the part of the faculty comes into play, for we want to avoid reducing these arts to abstracted techniques and methods. That means that we must be rich in illustrative materials, in models, paradigms, exemplars, our own or those given us by colleagues. Here are some examples of such concreteness. In Rhetoric, for instance, what would it do to America's greatest speech, the Gettysburg Address, if we substituted 87 for 77 years ago? Or what would it do in logic if the fundamental law of assertoric speech, that the same property cannot be asserted and denied of the same thing at the same time, valid when any child is both, were said to be valid when any child is both fully human and not yet quite so at any moment? Or set theory, how does a non-dimensional thought morph into two-dimensional space? That is, how does the abstract thought of class inclusion become visible in a spatial figure, like a Venn diagram? In the language tutorial, in trivial circumstances, a tutor will intervene more, direct and correct more, demand some rote learning, and even give quizzes. The chief exercise of this class, thank you. The chief exercise of this class is translation, best done from a dead language because of its fixity. We therefore, at St. John's College, learn Greek, which also supports our freshman texts, as you learn Quranic, that is classical Arabic. But later on, we learn French, in part because it is thought to refine sensibility. Plato's Socrates, who first enumerated the Quadrivium in the book called The Republic, refers earlier and briefly to the training of children's sensibility by poetry, which is to be well censored so as to suppress indecency and irreverence. It is the trivium for kindergarten. But for our freshmen, learning Greek allows us to raise such questions as this one. The Greeks have a word, arete, which can be translated as goodness or as excellence. Is goodness, which seems to include reticent modesty, compatible with excellence, which betokens ambitious standing out? We read uncensored a lot of poetry, ancient and modern, and thus are able to ask, is the poetry, say, of Homer, the poetry that comes from Olympus, different in kind from the modern poetry of which the American poet Wallace Stevens says, in contrast, and I quote him here, the poem of the mind in the act of finding what will suffice. It has not always had to find. The scene was set, it repeated what was in the script. He's referring to ancient myths. What we are able to inquire is the difference between the poetry of antiquity, whose script was an inherited myth and whose figures were brought down by the muses, and the poem of modern times, found, invented, in the poet's own mind, with no tradition waiting and no divinities descending. The second set of 4 arts is the Quadrivium, and it consists of arithmetic, plane geometry, solid geometry, and music. Arithmetic introduces number and calculation. Plane geometry measures flat surfaces, such as Earth presents locally, and solid geometry constructs matterless bodies, particularly the famous 5 regular solids. Thus, a mathematical counterworld is generated with which we give a rational account of the cosmos, of well-ordered nature. The culminating fourth art adds motion. It is called music in antiquity because the most spectacular such motions, those seen in the heavens, were thought to move in systems, the Greek for which is harmonies, and to generate heavenly consonances. We call such systems of solids in motion and their powers physics nowadays. For music in the normal sense, we do have its own tutorial, where from physical production of the diatonic scale and its consonances onto the elements of composition, students learn to listen knowledgeably and to analyze scores and even to compose their own. For the modern study of physics, we have added an 8th skill, that of replicating experiments in which nature is forced, as Kant says, to answer our questions as a prisoner before an interrogating judge. It becomes one of our major questions, whether the answers forced from nature in the laboratory, although they render her rational and operable, present her truly and wholly. The progressive skills of the Quadrivium are represented in our curriculum by the mathematical sciences, kinematics, through classical dynamics, relativity theory, and quantum mechanics. We complement these sciences of mere bodies with the sciences of living bodies, anatomy, genetics, and evolution. The first of the quadrivial arts, namely arithmetic, has a special standing since it raises fundamental questions about counting and account giving. Socrates thinks of it as the engine which first levers us into reflection. What he asks is a number, say 2, such that although it is made up of ones, it has no trace of oneness in it, while, say, a pair of cherries taken together is as cherryish and as juicily red as what was each single cherry. To be perplexed by the phrase, each one, together 2, is, he says, the mark of a willingness to wonder. That is, to think on the brink of philosophic reflection, and we would like our students to have this experience. Again, the pedagogy of the Quadrivium is fitted to the matter. There is the hands-on laboratory and its novel mathematics of motion, developed after the Quadrivium was discovered, namely the calculus. There are proofs to be put on the board with help from the class. We wonder together why the proof of a theorem does not allow us as much discretion as the translation of a sentence. Our characteristic teaching mode for the Quadrivium, for mathematics and science, assumes that it is natural for human beings to understand them, that it is the very meaning of mathematics. From Greek, mathematics in Greek means what is learnable. So we go here especially slow and deep, slow enough to carry along everyone some of the way, deep enough to elicit the naive and fundamental questions often most present to beginners. Thus, the Quadrivium leaves its mark even on those students who don't take in much detail. Perhaps the most basic perplexity associated with mathematical science is how our world, murky, variable, and aberrant, comes to be intelligible through the most crystalline, lucid, and definitive of mental activities, which is what mathematics is. How does the messy world come to be rediscovered as a cosmos, a thing of ordered beauty, and by its very regularity amenable to practical exploitation? Those are questions we ask in the laboratory. 5. How a liberal education has great books as its gist and its essence. The arts, then, are ancillary to liberal learning, which has a matter of its own, without which it would descend into that vacuous talk for which students have a term borrowed from the bovine life processes. This matter is the great books. Great is once more concretely and specifically signifying term for us. These works are above us. We couldn't write them. They're also for us. Their authors meant us to read them. Moreover, they affect us. They take us out of ourselves and return us to ourselves, the better for it. That's their effect on us. Here's the nature in themselves. They're inexhaustible. Every reading, after an often semi-stunned first time, reveals subtleties unnoticed before. They're beautiful. It might be a crotchety or canonical, a stylish or a crooked, a perfect or blemished beauty, or, that's also a possibility, the ugly beauty of mere sharp intelligence. Great books are original. They go to the beginning of things. Great fictions give the lie to reality. They imagine worlds and figures with more actuality than mere facts possess, while it would be hyperbole to claim that they move the soul more boisterous than do real existences. It is fair to say that they move it more resonantly. I won't go on, though I could. Books with such and more features are the fitting study matter of liberal education. They are, as I said before, better than subjects because they are not yet jigged into preordained categories. They are more initial and so more rich in questions. Once again, we arrange them in chronological order because that is, or can be thought of as, a meaninglessly mechanical ordering, and so devoid of prejudgment about true priorities. Let students decide which is intellectually earlier, Einsteinian relativity or the Newtonian dynamics that turns out to be a local instance of the former, and which is simpler, the time of relativity, that is nothing but what a clock tells, or the classical absolute time, that is an elaborate mental construal requiring a divine mind, namely God's sensorium, in which to take place. The great book's curriculum, too, has its proper pedagogy. We meet around a table in a class called the seminar being Latin for seed bed. Our seminars of 20 souls at the very most are normally led by 2 tutors who guard the conversation, among other ways by being 2 and so not easily addressed directly by students who should be talking mostly to each other. Moreover, these 2 colleagues offer occasional demonstrations that well-read, rational adults can differ severely from each other. By and large, tutors are supposed to be very recessive in the conversation. Pity the oldest tutor stuffed with undelivered wisdom, even judiciously allowing it occasionally to go off the rails as though, or through the roof. Yet its main focus should be the meaning of the book of the evening, followed by, and this is distinctive since it is prescribed in most university classrooms, so even allowing the bold question, is this true? For our pedagogic aim is not to leave students indecisively befuddled among our circa 175 texts, but to enable them to form opinions they can live with. Seminar takes place bi-weekly in the evenings when students grow loquacious. Tutors take turns asking an open question, an art which, together with its products, is a part of the college's teaching tradition. Although this question rarely directs the 2 whole hours of the seminar, it starts the conversation off, for well and for ill. It should, of course, not be the sort of teacher's question that is done away with by a one-word answer, say a fact. This question might surreptitiously embody a tutor's theory of the work, or it might fix on a detail that contains a key to the whole. Great authors love to lurk in little items. Effective tutors spend time preparing their question. Here's an example. When Aristotle delineates the figure of a natural slave, a defective human incapable of making decisions, is he rationalizing or delegitimizing actual Greek slavery, which was supplied by captured soldiery and defeated populations that didn't fit this definition? Tutors' seminar anxiety derives from this situation. They feel, and indeed are, responsible for the student's experience without having the power really to direct it. Students' pressure, on the other hand, comes from having to prepare faithfully and participate regularly. They must control a tendency to supine marginality, such as deprives the class of their contribution, or contrary impulse to answer every question first, producing subsequent silence. There is no seminar method. Our seminar is intended to do what professionals think is impossible, to conduct during a prepared, scheduled event a natural, spontaneous conversation. In fact, there are only 2 rules: civility, to attain which we address each other as Ms., Mr., Miss, Mrs., whichever students chooses. I have to say that I balked at mix, which is a new one. One graduation day, Ms. Bennett, for 4 years, becomes Elizabeth to me for life, and that's a great moment for both of us. The other rule is, be willing to explain yourself, at least to explain why you can't explain, and that's it. Or perhaps a third rule, listen with respect and regard no expression of the human mind, especially no question, no matter how naive, as uninteresting. If you didn't prepare, come anyhow and acquire the art of winging it. It's always best to be there, since the school is a community of learning. We mean to have our studies and our talk in common, but don't imagine that tutors can't tell when you haven't read the book. A dean, long dead, used to describe the seminar experience by sweeping out a roller coaster in the air, miserable lows and exhilarating highs. We give up dismal currency, so-called relevance, for perennial heights, truths too true to be squalid, and we avoid fixed subject for originality, future topics taking shape. We avoid history insofar as it treats what came before us as bygone. It's history, as people say, meaning it's gone inactive, because we think that greatness is timeless, ever fresh. As we disregard mere time if it stands in the way of living meaning, so we don't let the mediation of scholars and the opinings of intellectuals come between us and these program books. Therefore, we discourage our students from reading introductions and background essays, or better, from referring to them in our conversation. Let them read what they like. What they really like, it turns out, is fantasy literature, to relieve, I imagine, all the actuality we confront them with. So to sum up the spirit of the liberality in this education, we cherish directness, immediacy, and closure with the text. We are convinced that minutely careful, laboriously analytic construal of passages, alternating with the comprehensively sweeping intake of wholes, far from killing texts, makes them come alive. To have learned to read means being able to make much of little by apprehending significance in detail, but also to succeed in comprehending concisely and epitomizing large designs with accurate brevity. If that seems as if learning how to read were the practical purpose of liberal education, there's truth in it, providing reading is taken largely enough. It ought to be understood as knowing how to interpret everything, from the secrets of the book of nature to the expressions of the human face, from subtleties of poetries to the potencies of mathematical diagrams. What is the truest profit of learning literacy? It's simple. It eradicates boredom. And boredom is the most dangerous human condition. It breeds cleverly rationalized violence. It follows that we wish to be serious, but never dead earnest, for laughter is the enabler of faithful learning. As for the life rhythms of our students, we hope they will alternate studious solitude with communicative sociableness. We hope they will discover the close-to-the-book industry that should alternate with gazing into space leisure, with putting the text off in order to look inward and reflect. For study is not yet thinking, and thinking, which cannot be taught but can be incited, is what we would wish our students to experience. Am I right in imagining that it's the same at Zaytuna College? Thank you.
I want to just start off with that last statement you made about boredom, something I've been thinking about for some time. David Foster Wallace has an essay called "This is Water" that the freshmen have been reading, and he talks about the day in and day out. It was a commencement speech that he gave, but he talks about the day in and day out that the students don't yet know about, just the difficulty of the day in and day out of life. And one of the things, I think Pascal said that most of the world's problems were a result of the inability of an individual to sit with himself in his room. And Van Dorn says something in liberal education He says there's a well-known legend about the citizen who wakes up at 40 to find himself going through a routine, the meaning of which he has never known, and the value of which he may now doubt. His days repeat themselves, and he cannot find a theme among the more or less dead sounds they make when they strike in time. The reason could be that he had missed the heart of the human doctrine, which deals with repetition, routine, and refrain. Life is monotonous. The arts, and especially the liberal arts, know what to make of the fact, how much to accept it and dignify it with duties, how much to defy it or correct it with pleasure, pretense, play, and speculation. The heathen of 40 is only one case in point. When the liberal arts fail to do their work, civilization has become a disease. When they are dismissed as a luxury, practical affairs suffer the consequence. They are the most practical possession men have, and they proceed by method, not by knack. Education is not had at random, though we have been acting as if that were the case.
Bravo.
So I think one of the things that people seem to love excitement, and I think a lot of wars actually start because people are just bored.
Yeah, is it excitement they love, or is it excitation? They want to be stimulated,
right?
But it's not exciting.
Right.
It's simply stimulation. And I think it happens less to people who are well educated, because what do they have? They're doing something boring, some routine that they have to follow. Usually, in fact, they have the kind of job that isn't just routine. But everyone's got to do routine things.
Right.
Well, what do they have? They have poetry in their head.
Just going to get a little closer.
Yeah. Okay. That okay now? Yeah.
Yeah.
So I was saying, what is the advantage that someone who's undergone a liberal education has over someone who hasn't? People have poetry in their head. They have images in their head, either of visuals, the visual art that they've looked at, or of pictures that they formed while reading fictions. They look at things and they know when they're funny. I mean, people engaging in routines do give our subjects for a comedy. As Charlie Chaplin's a good example of showing that, right? When you,
right.
I think that well-educated people are less bored than people who have no education. And as for boredom itself, people need excitement, and they substitute excitation for it, and often it ends in violence. I really think that boredom is about the most dangerous.
I really agree with you on that. Yeah. I wanted to ask you about, well, first, just liberal arts and liberal education. This is a contested term now, I think.
It's not even contested anymore. It's just, it's meaningless.
It's meaningless, yeah. We read a book, the faculty read a book together called Learning to Flourish by De Nicola, and he argues that there's five different definitions of liberal arts out there. One of them was just the transmission of a cultural heritage to the next generation. And then he talks about the idea of self-actualization, and then about engaging the world or even transforming the world. But one of them was learning the arts. In other words, learning how to learn. And one of the things that you said in the Paradoxes of Education in a Republic is that education was essentially learning how to read.
Yeah, I said it tonight too. Yeah.
Right.
Where reading is taken in a very broad way, interpreting. In other words, you look at someone's face, you read their face. You can tell whether they're pretending to be lively, but they're really feeling melancholy and sad, or you just know how to look. There's the book of nature, so-called. That's a very old term. And if you learn some mathematics, and you know of theories of nature which make all the variety suddenly lucid and understandable. And what is sheer messiness becomes intelligible. So it seems to me that reading is, I think one might use it, can be very broad, in which case it really is what education teaches you how to do.
Well, one of the things about reading, one is it's incredibly difficult to read. I mean, obviously, just to learn basic reading, but
I don't think it's incredible.
Really?
Well, you need time.
I mean, you've been reading some of the most difficult books for 60 years. So at this point, you might not think reading is very difficult. But if you kind of think back about 60 years ago when you began that journey, I mean, let me give you an example. One of the things that I actually saw a man recently who's written a book arguing that sentences have become much simpler, which is a good thing because sentences were much more difficult to read even 100 years ago. Somebody like Melville, for instance. And he argued that since the Elizabethan period, sentences have consistently gotten easier to read. But that made me think about why complex compound sentences were there in the first place. Because I'll give you an example. In your book, I had to read more than once paragraphs 2 or 3 times. And not because the vocabulary is all fine, it wasn't, but there was just a lot in there. And I think in some ways, language was more difficult because they were demanding that you think more seriously about what they're writing. We're in an age of skim reading, where people read online and read very fast. And
well, it's both the way the words are put together, that is to say that the sentences were more complex and they more sub-clauses and qualifying phrases. It's also that people had larger vocabularies, and I think a large vocabulary is really important, because if you want to, how to put it, I would say ingest the world, if you want to make the world your own, the way we have to do it is to describe it to ourselves. And if it's a complicated and interesting world, you need subtle and differentiated words to do it with.
Right, nuance.
And I have to tell you, probably my most used book at home is Roger's Thesaurus. Yeah. You know, where you look up a word in the index and it sends you to a paragraph of all the similar but slightly different words that are connotations of the one you're looking for. Then you read through it and you pick the one that really means what your meaning is supposed to be. Then with that you capture a piece of the world and it's yours. So it seems to me a large vocabulary, which one gets first from reading a lot, then from looking up words. My favorite dictionary is the Heritage Dictionary.
It's a great dictionary.
Yeah, a great dictionary. And then from using them unabashedly. And people that read what you've written or hear what you say, they may not know the word. It's not necessary to know every word and to understand what's being said, but eventually you pick things up and you get in the habit of looking words up that you don't understand. Once you're in position of a large vocabulary, not only is reading books simpler, but getting hold of the world is possible. And
well, there's something in the Arabic tradition which is called fiqh al-lugha, which means the subtle distinctions of language. And so, I mean, I'll give you an example. The Arabs, like this they would call a kas, but if it didn't have any liquid in it, they called it zujaja. So they distinguish between a vesicle for drinking that has liquid in it and one that doesn't.
yes,
Or they'd call like a table that has food on it. There's a different word for that than a table that doesn't have food on it.
that's nice.
And the language is filled with these distinctions, which modern Arabs don't know anymore, because it seems that language, we lose these subtle meanings.
Yeah, and in English has this fundamental complexity that it's a double language. Some of it's Anglo-Saxon,
right,
some of it's Latinate, and they often two words mean
well, like freedom and liberty.
Freedom and liberty, on the face of it, the same thing. You begin to think about it. You read where these words are used accurately, and suddenly you know a lot more about what it means to live in a free country. And,
Adler wrote a 2-volume book on freedom.
Yeah, so acquiring a vocabulary, I'm very much, when you're reading, especially when you're reading fiction, you don't know a word, forget it, just get on with it. You don't want to interrupt yourself all the time. But over time, this takes time, pick it up.
I have to look it up.
You have to look it up? It depends on the temperament.
I probably spend more time in a dictionary than any other book. And I'm always finding Arabic words that I don't know, too, which really bothers me.
See, especially if you're reading fiction, you sometimes just want to get on with it and see what happens.
Well, if it's great fiction, there's a reason why they chose that word over other words. I mean, Flaubert.
You're missing something.
Flaubert spent a lot of time working on le mot juste, right?
But you can't, it seems to me, if you hold yourself to an absolute standard like that, the moment will come when you don't want to do it anymore. That's the worst.
Doesn't happen.
Yeah, it doesn't happen. Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
I think you have to love words.
Yeah.
I think, to me, there's just, words are amazing. It's just amazing communication and speaking, and I think what's broken down, our society has an inability right now just to talk to each other. You said one of the most important things is just civility.
Yeah, but that's not usually because people know different words.
Well,
they know the same words and mean something else.
The words mean different things, and I think that's why the medieval distinguo, the idea, which is part in our tradition and in the Islamic tradition, like in the scholastic tradition, you had an obligation to know the words that you were using, and your interlocutor had the right to demand a definition if you introduced a term. And I think, if people would take that more seriously, just thinking about the words that they use and being more...
Something really good would happen. Everything would slow down a lot.
Right.
Yeah. So I have to agree with that. But it seems to me that if you hold yourself, or especially if you hold students to too rigorous a standard about it, you might wreck the whole thing. So I'll sometimes just let it be.
I think you're too nice to the students. Dr. Brann. Yeah. We expel them if they don't read. They can't wing it here. We just kick them out. Let me ask you, because something really struck me here about what you said about method, if I can find it here. Here. You said that it must be observed here that arts can yield methods when they are applied with purpose and philosophical justification to a certain realm, as mathematics may be applied to nature, logic to deliberation, and music, for example, to therapy. Again, one or the other may be generalized into a universal art, as Descartes did with mathematics to found the analytic method. It follows that, as is often suggested, to teach students methods of analysis as if they were neutral, intellectual tools is insidiously to indoctrinate them, and very powerfully too. In any case, both arts and methods are perfectly incapable of teaching students to think. You know, when I actually wrote critical theory on the side
Yes, yeah.
here, because I think about students that have been indoctrinated into certain ways of viewing. As you know, a lot of literary scholarship now is all through the lens of critical theory. So young students will go who love literature. They'll love reading Jane Austen, and so they go and major in literature. But then they get a professor who spends the entire time deconstructing Jane Austen's hidden assumptions about the hierarchy of Georgian England,
Yes, yeah.
and the intersectionality between the oppressive nature of the maids and the servants in Jane Austen's novels and English colonization. So my point being that it seems to me that method now is everything in academia, and I'm just wondering what...
I think you're absolutely right. And I keep asking myself what the reason is. Well, one reason, I think, is the really pernicious business of having to produce articles. And the actual field, which is the books themselves, are pretty much exhausted after 100 years of producing articles. So you have to sort of go to another level. So one reason for it is it's article producing. You can always find one more conception which seems novel and set it out as a method of approach. That's one reason. The other reason is that I think people now go into graduate studies for reasons which have nothing to do with the subject. They want to prepare themselves for jobs. But the ones who go into, say, English because they loved literature,
Right.
they soon leave. They can't bear it, right? They don't like it. Goes for philosophy, too. So some of the people who produce these concept constructions never were interested in the subject matter to begin with, and they live in a higher region and they breathe a purer air, and it's terminally boring.
Dr. Nasser calls most of what's practiced today in philosophy departments, he calls it misosophy. That it's more like the hatred of antipathy towards wisdom.
Yeah, there is the ethics of suspicion.
Right.
That is that everything is supposed to be suspect as being really a surreptitious assertion of power, and people have power on their mind when very often it has nothing to do with power. There's somebody having a thought-out opinion and voicing it. So there are all kinds of reasons, none of them very good for it happening.
You mentioned earlier, and I'd like you to revisit it if you don't mind, about Charmides and about what that dialogue about the idea of a knowledge, a meta-knowledge.
Well, there's a Platonic dialogue called the Charmides. It's a long and interesting dialogue whose main effort is to show that, well, the people in the dialogue, particularly Charmides, a very beautiful young man, and his guardian, they want to show that there is such a thing as a knowledge of knowledge. And the knowledge of knowledge means that you don't actually know any particular thing, but you have a theory that covers all knowing, so that you're a judge of whether knowledge is profitable or unprofitable without really knowing it. And the dialogue makes the argument very well, but what's interesting to me is that both these people, but especially Charmides, became really bad actors. That is to say, cruel, murdering tyrants in Athens, members of the so-called 30, which were a group of well, only comparable
Tyrants.
to Nazis.
Right, they were Nazis, yeah.
And I think that when Plato wrote the dialogue, even though in the dialogue these people are young, I think Charmides maybe 14, 15, he was saying this way of thinking is a way of domination and of tyranny. Right. So be careful.
Another thing that was really interesting, because point 7, I want to talk a little bit about that in your lecture, just about the idea. I mean, obviously since the 1960s, temporal politics has become so central now to the educational experience. And the idea of stepping outside of the world for a brief period of time to enable you to really think much more deeply about the world, as opposed to being completely caught up in the temporality of it. I mean, C.S. Lewis talks about, he talks about the snobbery of now, that everything is about now, and losing sight of what's beyond now. So I want to read a passage that you quoted from Nietzsche, from The Gay Science, in your book. He says, "When I think of the lust for action, which continually tickles and spurs all the millions of young Europeans who cannot bear boredom and themselves, then I apprehend that there must be in them lust for suffering in some way, in order to derive from that suffering a probable cause for doing. For a deed, need is needful. Hence the shouting of the politicians, hence the many made-up, exaggerated, critical needs of all possible classes, and the blind readiness to believe in them. This young world demands that there should come or become visible from the outside, not happiness, but unhappiness, and their imagination is busy, even beforehand, with forming it into a monster, so that they can afterwards fight with a monster." You know, I thought just about so many young, I mean, I think that defines so much. People wanting, they relish the grievances to get out of thinking at a deeper
the relish
level.
of grievances is certainly a strong motive for much that goes on. In other words, another way to put it, people enjoy their self-righteousness, and that is a relish.
Because the Stoics would have just seen that you have a certain set of circumstances and you can't really change them. And so what you have to do then is really think about what you can actually change. And for most of them, that meant working on the self as the central project of one's life, as opposed to trying to change the world. And the idea that you can't really truly transform the world until you've transformed yourself. And one of the things about Dr. King in the letter from a Birmingham jail, he talks about that if you're going to confront the tyrant, you have to go through this process. And one of the points that he makes is you have to look into yourself and see if those qualities that you want to fight are present in your own behavior or attitudes.
Yeah, and another point he makes, which is sort of lives in the same world, is that if you want to oppose what's going on, you have to pay. You have to be ready to pay, and you have to pay. In other words, you have to go to jail.
Right.
And to ask for amnesty before you do it is absurd. Yeah? So he's dealing with a certain kind of agitation that he didn't approve of. But what I've never quite understood is how parents would not be happy to hear that their students are going to have 4 years of learning things that have no immediate application to making a living.
Right.
They might in the long run, but no mean. And the object of which is simply for them to have glorious 4 years of inquiry into things that are interesting and into themselves.
Right.
That they're not willing to hear about or to do, but they're perfectly willing to have those same kids drink all through the weekend and watch games and do all kinds of nefarious things. I don't understand it.
It's amazing.
It's amazing.
Yeah, it is. You called one of the things that I liked. You said it was that liberal education was pre-practical.
Yeah, and look, to me it seems a simple hypothesis. First, you have to know what's good. Then you can change the world. What's the point of, our students, they sometimes say this, I'm sure you sometimes say it. I want to change the world.
Right.
I ask for the better. They hadn't considered that aspect of it, right? In other words, producing change or being productive is an unfinished intention. You've got to know what you're doing.
Right.
And where do you learn what you're doing except?
You said there's a misconstruction of enlightened utility that has to do with the notion that education should make one above all useful to others, an improver of society. Students themselves sometimes display a certain dubious innocence in this matter. There are some who go to college to learn how to affect the lives of others, how to solve the problems of society, how to change the world, and they state these aims with the perfect certainty that they're feasible and desirable.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm going to open it up, if you don't mind, to some questions. Mm-hmm. So people want to...
There's a microphone. There's a microphone up front on the left.
Oh, okay.
If anyone has a question, if they could please just line up to the microphone on the left.
This is one of our great liberal artists here at the school, so we're very fortunate to have him.
Dr. Brann, thank you very much for being with us this evening. It's a tremendous pleasure. If I understood you correctly, it is not the place of an education in the liberal arts to prepare college-age young people to be productive in society. Is that correct?
Yes. Look, I've expressed it a little extremely, but
I'm about to go after it,
correct.
so.
It's not the direct, it shouldn't be the direct attention. It could be an ancillary outcome.
And yet the Jeffersonian ideal, at least insofar as public education is concerned, specifically at the level of grammar, is not so much to prepare young people, for example, for a trade, or even to prepare them for college, but rather to prepare them for meaningful participation in a pluralistic democracy.
Right.
Yeah.
And this, in my mind, is associated precisely with the stratum of grammar education.
Yeah. Well,
could you speak to that for us, please? Thank you.
in this book, which is
yeah.
pretty old, there's an attack on Jefferson.
Yeah.
which is part of it.
It's one of the paradoxes that Dr. Brann addresses in the book about this idea of a utilitarian purpose for education, despite the fact that the man that was advocating it was deeply steeped in a liberal education.
He himself, and not, for instance, he wants to throw out all theology. He had a big theological library.
Yeah, I know. But so my question, I guess, is not so much Jefferson himself, but surely we want young Americans to be prepared for meaningful participation in a pluralistic democracy.
It seems to me most preparation of that sort is best done in apprenticeships, in professional schools, in graduate school. I'm seriously thinking that they ought to be 4 years. At the moment, they're usually between 17 and 21 or 22.
But we dare not
that's
defer it
the
to that
purpose.
age, because we've already given the vote to 18-year-olds. So we've got in some manner to equip 18-year-olds for meaningful participation in a pluralistic democracy.
Yeah, and
Either that or defer the voting age to maybe, I don't know, until postgraduate school.
well,
I'm in favor of that myself.
what's our difference here, really? What are you saying a college education ought to do?
I have the sense that the real weight of this Jeffersonian ideal is meant to be carried in grammar school, so that ideally the young person who is himself or herself engaged in the kind of liberal arts education that we've envisioned here is already capable of participating meaningfully in a pluralistic democracy.
So, are you saying that this ideal of a liberal education that is non-vocational should simply occur earlier?
At least the first stratum of the Trivium needs to have begun
I think
much earlier.
Traditionally it would have been high school, where a lot of, in fact, really the Trivium begins in grammar school, like you said. The grammar, one of the things about mathematics traditionally, mathematics until the late 19th century was not taught to anybody until they reached about 12 or 13, because it was seen too abstract and the mind wasn't ready for it. And I think a lot of math anxiety comes out of introducing mathematics too early to students, because, like you said, math is learnable. Socrates shows, the young servant boy that's able to penetrate a mystery of geometry.
But look, is that really the point, that it should be done earlier?
I'm wondering if it's not possible to reconcile the St. John's ideal with regard to the liberal arts and the Jeffersonian ideal as well.
See, I think Jefferson is not a propagator of liberal education. Look, for one thing, I think of liberal education, it happens to be expensive, and therefore it's not as universally accessible as one would hope it would be. But Jefferson is seriously a non-democrat. I mean, he has this reputation of being the liberal of liberals, but as he said in that famous Rockfish Gap report on the education, that I think he uses the word, the garbage or refuse has to be separated from the ones. Well, that's not the way you talk about your fellow citizens, right? And his notion of an education is thoroughly state-directed, in the sense that he really wants to, he wants a reading list from which the Federalists are removed because he's a states writer. He wants theology removed because he thinks that that is an infringement on people's free thinking. The reading list that he proposes is a thoroughly purified reading list. It's not my idea of a great books list.
Adams has a brilliant refutation to his desire to remove theology from. He wanted it out of the colleges, and Adams said it's something that won't go away, and that you have to leave it in.
Right, but without defending Jefferson himself, nor the whole of his pedagogical instinct, surely we can agree that there is an exigency to prepare young Americans for participation in a meaningful democracy. Meaningful participation in a pluralistic democracy. And since we're talking about 18-year-olds who have the right to vote already, it seems to me that some portion of the liberal arts needs to be retrojected in the education of children so that teenagers, at least, are being formed in minimally grammar.
If you look, an example that I use is I inherited from my great-grandmother through my father Edward Bain's book that used to be taught. It was a high school textbook for her on rhetoric. And on the section on emotions, he goes into great detail about the use that demagogues use with fear, and that in a democratic society, citizens should always be vigilant when they hear politicians trying to frighten them because they use that to take away their rights. I think a lot of what you're talking about, if, for instance, a lot of rhetoric, which was taught at high school, quite in the 19th century, everybody who went to high school would have studied logic and rhetoric. But I think rhetoric deals with a lot of that.
I thought you were talking about vocational.
No, I think preparation
Talking about
to be citizens.
Right, exactly.
Right.
How would one achieve that?
This is the great question in my mind, because it seems
the danger there seems to me to be that if you seriously involved in training citizens, you're going to be inevitably ideological. They're either going to be liberal or conservative or somewhere in between. I don't think you can preserve the liberality of liberal education if some sort of practical intention of forming citizens, not indirectly because they've been in an environment where they thought about fundamental questions, but because they've been urged to be active in some way. I think this is invariably political. It's on the way to politicizing education.
Would that mean then that the proper formation for citizens, which would necessarily eschew any kind of indoctrination, would need to focus on fundamental principles, like grammar?
Look, I'll tell you something that happened just in the last 2 weeks at my college. One of the representatives of the student government calls itself the Student Committee on Instruction, and they're taken seriously by the Committee on Instruction that runs the program, came to me to ask if I would come to a forum, which is the kind of meeting that they run, and talk about some currently worrisome problem. As it happened, I just had a conversation with a colleague who said that she was worried about the politicization of the classroom, which we had avoided for years and which seems to be creeping back in. It comes in with calls for students to be activators of some sort, that is to say, to agitate in one way or the other, which they can do on their time off all they want. And so we agreed that we would have, hasn't happened yet, but it will in a couple of weeks, to have a meeting in which we're going to raise the question of what it means to have politics in the classroom. And one way I think of it is there is political philosophy, which we should do a lot of, study a lot, especially the American fundamental documents. And then there's politics. And it seems to me that calls for students to engage in political activity are always ideologically motivated. It depends on by whom, but it's, if someone wants students to go out and demonstrate, incidentally, in ordinary life, when you demonstrate, you have to demonstrate something. But here it's always you demonstrate, right? What? That depends on who brought you to do it. Well, I think this should be avoided. So I'm against such action. And
thank you very much.
I'll leave it there. Yeah.
I'll leave the microphone for the next speaker.
Any other, okay.
Slide this out a little bit.
Thank you.
Good evening, Dr. Brann. It's really an honor to have you. I'm a freshman here at the college, and I had 2 questions. You could decide to expand on either of them, either one of them. The first question was, from my understanding, you said that a liberal education wasn't best achieved through, at least in the classroom, through a series of questions. Rather,
could you say that again?
Through a series of questions. You said rather it was a conversation, like the best way to achieve a liberal education was through a conversation. Could you differentiate what a series of questions would be in light of what a true conversation would be in the classroom?
I missed some of that. But you
So just that you had mentioned that the best method through liberal education is a series of questions.
Yeah.
And then you talked
right.
about the conversation. So I think the question is the difference between the series of questions and the actual conversation that's generated by the questions.
And how that conversation is really what is the best mode of engagement in the classroom.
Yeah. I distinguished conversation from discussion, argument, and so on. Sometimes you have an argument, and often you have a discussion, but we like to think that we are in fact simply conversing with each other. And such conversation is usually dominated by some problem or question that arises. And I think the way the question enters in the conversation, that it's always behind what's driving what we're saying to each other. Someone, for instance, someone might ask, what is the role of intellectuals in American politics? Well, we'd have a discussion about what it means to be an intellectual, what the difference is between being philosophically interested and being an intellectual. And that question would simply stand behind the conversation we are having and guide it. And the outcome is usually that participants, and it doesn't need to be 2, as many people get together, not that they come away with a solution, but that they come away with a lot of clarification. They know what they're talking about better than they did. We do want our students to come to some conclusions for themselves, but that's not immediately necessary. That's in the long run. And most our students don't leave being terminally befuddled. It's not like that. They come usually with very clear notions, but they can, if they were good students, they can tell why. And that'll be the result of having conversations that were driven by questions which were not simply problem-solving questions, but were deep questions. I don't know if that answers
that
you.
helps. And my second question was if you could expand a little bit about, you mentioned in the sense of a liberal education that there were tutors who were guardians of knowledge or guardians of that subject, and perhaps Sheikh Hamza can talk about something similar in the Islamic tradition, about tutors being the guardians of knowledge that seek people engaging in that liberal education. Furthermore.
Should I? Will you tell me what?
Well, I think it's interesting. The divorce of the liberal arts from religion is pretty recent.
Yeah.
It was certainly at the heart of the St. John's movement. I think
Yeah.
that they were grappling with the loss of religion in the 20th century, and I think a lot of what they were trying to do was to in reforming education, and I think Adler in 1939 wrote an essay about the nihilism that permeated modern universities, and that the students really didn't believe in anything, and relativism was so prevalent. And I think what they were trying to do in essence was to make to take meaning. In fact, Dreyfus wrote a book called All Things Shining recently. I don't know if you saw that book, but that book was about trying to find meaning in a secular age through the great books. And I think what they were trying to do was to give Western civilization, because it had lost the grounding of religion. For 2,000 years it was Christianity that really was at the root of a lot of Western civilization.
I don't know if that's still true, you know. I mean, there are great resurgences of all sorts of religious movements.
No, I know. This is my point, is that I think what these arts were, even Pythagoras, who is the first to articulate the arts, was coming out of a very profoundly mystical religious tradition. And I know that the Jewish tradition, the Muslim tradition, and the Christian tradition all use the liberal arts. In fact, a lot of them believe that it comes from Proverbs, that God has built his house of wisdom upon 7 pillars. And so I think for the Islamic tradition, that my understanding is that the arts were a means to try to penetrate meaning itself and to understand at a deeper level. They were used in the Muslim tradition similar to the way that St. Augustine and On Christian Doctrine is arguing for their use. Because I think fundamentalism and fanaticism are ultimately, when religion becomes divorced from an intellectual tradition, that you get this very dangerous type of character that has an absolute certainty about what they believe. I can be certain about my faith, but I think I should always have a fallible understanding of the faith. In other words, that I can be certain about my belief in its truth, but I think it's very dangerous for me to be certain about my belief in what that faith, how it defines itself. Because then I want to impose it on other people. And that impulse seems to be a very dangerous human impulse.
Yeah, let me say something about the problems we face that you probably don't face here. We read the sacred books of the Jewish and the Christian tradition. We don't do Islamic, never try that. It's just more than we can do.
Sure.
And the question is this: how do we, in universities, when there are courses on religion, you have things like the Bible as literature or the Bible as history. That's a travesty, right? We want to read the Bible as a sacred book. Both Bibles, Jewish and Christian Bible. How do we do it? Some of our students are, in fact, Christians. Some of them are Jews. Most of them are secular. How do we get our students to treat sacred texts as sacred texts without believing them? It's very difficult. In fact, one might argue it's impossible. But we want them to read the books as a believer might read them, as they read them, as it ought to be read. In other words, we want every way of going at it to be respectful and true to the intention that we can discern in the book. It's a big problem, and we are not unaware of it.
Well, I think if you have just a type of respect for other people and what they hold sacred, that you're going to respect that. You might not believe it. And I think everybody, I think everybody should be free to criticize religion.
I think you need something more than respect. You need, or maybe not more, but something in addition to respect. You need imagination. You have to be able to put yourself in the place of someone who thinks that this text was not of human origin.
Right.
And if you can't imagine that, you're not doing it right. In other words, the imagination gives you a way of participating in a way that you don't yourself adopt. So that's, I think,
imagination is important. Did you have a question?
We'll take one last question for the time.
Are you a Zaytuna student? Okay.
Kind of going back to what you mentioned about indoctrination, and I guess in response to Father Francisco's question about how to prepare, I guess, students to have an open mind, yet not at the same time be indoctrinated, because I think at the same time, like, I guess in my limited experience, I've been noticing that, like, regardless of what kind of education you have, there's going to be some sort of bias. And as you mentioned, like, you're either going to come out like a liberal or a Republican, and I feel like it's hard for students sometimes to navigate, like, what kind of stuff you're supposed to take, and like balancing between being liberal, I guess, and being skeptical. So I guess more for the student, do you have any, I guess, advice or recommendations on how to best navigate through that?
Could you tell me exactly what I'm supposed to answer?
I think that you talked about indoctrination, the dangers of indoctrinating, and so, and that the idea of that Father Francisco was bringing up, just about preparing somebody to be civilly responsible, but at the same time not indoctrinating them. And so I think she was looking at how to navigate between having an open mind and being liberal, and at the same time...
It's a very good question.
Yeah.
Where should she go? Oh, there.
Yeah.
Look, here's one way to deal with it. It's got to be dealt with. Right? What do we mean by an open mind? Do we mean by an open mind an indeterminate mind? That is to say, when someone has an open mind, does that mean that she has no particular beliefs or faith? That can't be what it means, right? So it must be possible to have an open mind together with a settled faith. Let that be the hypothesis. Does it seem like a fair hypothesis? Then the question is, how is that possible? Because by a settled faith, one believes that there's a certain closure. And by an open mind, one believes that there's a certain readiness to change. I don't know the answer to that question, but it seems to me that that's the right question to think about and to keep in mind. And it isn't necessary to begin by saying it's impossible. It's necessary to begin by saying it's in fact necessary that it should be possible to be both open-minded and a believer. I think so. It's not a satisfying answer in the sense that it kind of runs away from the question. It says we simply have to assume that it's possible. But I think it's the right assumption to make. And then the question arises, what is the human mind such that it is, on the one hand, open to questions, and on the other hand, settled in its views? So let that be the question, based on the hypothesis that it is in fact a possibility. Does that,
I think I was more talking, I guess, about a classroom setting in particular. So it's not, like, I guess here it's not necessarily about holding on to your own beliefs because, like, we share the same religion, but I feel like even within the religion there are nuances, whether they're like religious nuances or just, I mean, every teacher has their own
difference of opinion.
Exactly, every teacher has their own style. So whether it's like exactly related to your set of beliefs or if it's just like, because like even within a school that's like as small and I guess as small as this, there's a lot of diversity even within the teachers. So I guess it does come back to knowing your beliefs, or I don't know, something to think about.
yeah. Could you,
She was just talking about the differences just even amongst the faculty and the students. There's a lot of diversity, and even though there might be a shared religion, but even within the context, there's still the diversity. And
yeah, which is, I mean, it seems to me the diversity is an incitement to thinking about why you're attached to one particular way, or why your teachers differ among themselves. In other words, these diversities are not to, I think they shouldn't be taken as a way to unsettle oneself, but rather as a way to inquire, why is this my faith? It might be that on the way of that inquiry you discover that you have to make changes. But it could also mean that you simply end up knowing more about what it is you're really thinking. And then you're still faced with the question, why do reasonable, respectable people whom you have some faith in think differently? Well, that makes it necessary for them to explain themselves. That's where the open-mindedness comes in. You have to listen and try to understand. But it seems to me that the notion that if you're open-minded, it means you have to be deeply unsettled, that's just pernicious. It's not the way we are, and though I can't explain why it's possible, I'm coming back to what I said before, it seems to me a fact, and it should be accepted that way.
Go ahead.
So in the beginning of your lecture, you mentioned that there are different perspectives held on how a liberal education should be conducted in the classroom. From what I understand, one of the things you mentioned is that the lecture format, in your perspective, may not be the best way to cultivate a liberal education in a student. And so what I'm wondering is how, or what advices do you have for students, particularly in their first year and their second year, on how to benefit and cultivate a liberal education, yet at the same time being so new to this process? Like, what do they have to contribute to a discussion if in this first year and second year, primarily, they're building that foundation in and of itself?
Could you again?
She's asking just about the lecture, that the idea that lectures are not the best way to,
Look, it seems to me that it could be regarded as a trivial matter, lectures or some other way, what's the difference? It seems to me it's not a trivial matter. And my guess is that Dr. Dilp, from whom I got the understanding of the importance of the lecture, would think, where is he?
Dr. Delp, is he still
maybe
here?
not here. Anyhow, he doesn't think it's trivial. And the reason it seems to me to be a fundamental importance, because when you hear a lecture, you're being given something. When you have a conversation, or even a discussion, but better just a conversation, you're not being given something, something's being elicited from you,
Right.
you have to respond. And that in turn comes to something very deep, namely, is authority, that is the authority of the interpreter of the prophet, or of the prophet himself, or in Christianity of the Christ, or of the prophets in the Jewish Bible. Is authority a necessary part of religious truth, or is it unnecessary because you yourself are the best judge? And I've been telling Sheikh Hamza that I was reading what I have the notion is the guardian writer of the saint of your program, namely al-Ghazali, who is, it seems to me, absolutely deeply involved in this question and who doesn't really know the answer to it. So I don't know the answer to it, but it seems to me it's absolutely the right question.
Yeah, it's a great question, and can I add something to that statement? I think we would differentiate between certain didactic subjects. For instance, in grammar, there's 8 or 9 parts of speech, depending on who you ask, whether articles and adjectives, how you categorize articles. Are they adjectives or are they a separate part of speech? But that's something that you learn. It's a didactic truth, or the fact that triangles all add up to 180 degrees.
Well, that's conditionally true.
Okay, that's conditionally true. That's your subject, not mine. But the point being is that there are certain things that, like, when we teach logic here, and Dr. Delp teaches logic, it's not really a good thing to discuss, for instance, you can discuss the 3 laws of thought, but you can't debate about what they are. There's a certain, if you're teaching that subject in Aristotelian iteration of it.
Yeah, look, it seems to me that if the object is, where's the
questioner.
If the object is to say clearly what Aristotle thinks, that, I guess, not that there isn't plenty of debate about it, but it has some of the characteristics of what you call didactic knowledge, because he himself speaks of didactic knowledge.
Right.
But if the question is, and so that's certainly always, seems to me, should always be something that happens in class. You've tried to figure out what the text actually says and how it's meant. But then comes the really important question, which is what is said here unconditionally true, conditionally true, or plain false? And certainly the law of contradiction is only conditionally true, because when it comes to certain Western philosophers, they might be Islamic thinkers, it's not the case that you can't say opposites of the same thing about the same thing at the same time. I gave an example in the lecture, right? It's true of a child that it is a human being, and it's equally true of a child that it's not quite a human being. At least that's what Aristotle thinks, right? So Aristotle knew perfectly well you can say the same thing.
Right, and there's potentiality and actuality.
There's potentiality and actuality, and then there is dialectic, Hegelian dialectic, for instance, in which it becomes essential to be able to think opposites at the same time, that is, to hold them together and to synthesize them. So I think they're two phases.
Again, it gets back to there are certain things, for instance, in Arabic grammar, there are different schools like we have the two dominant schools are the Kufan from Kufa in Iraq and the Basran school. And they differ. They used to throw shoes at each other in the mosques, debating about whether the verb was the source of all language or was it the substantive. That was a big debate in early Islam.
Yeah.
And they got very heated. It wasn't like a civil debate all the time.
Yeah.
But the point is that there's two positions and on that.
Yes.
Which one is true? Well, the dominant school says it's the substantive. The lesser school, they lost the debate. They said it was
lose forever.
Okay, and the point is you can debate that and discuss that in a classroom, but to teach grammar as a didactic subject so that they have the tools to understand and to be able to actually discuss. I mean, one of the problems, and I think this is a real problem in our universities, is that most students don't know grammar anymore. The fact that you can get a Bachelor of Arts without knowing grammar is amazing. And grammar in our culture has been reduced to punctuation. Right,
Well,
but grammar is
least of all. You yourself gave the example. And what's that big book we were talking about that we both didn't get into?
Infinite Jest.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No punctuation.
He was a great grammarian. No, he had good punctuation.
Yeah.
David Foster Wallace.
But sometimes none.
Very gnarly sentences, but he was. They called him the grammar Nazi at school because he was very, very adamant about teaching grammar. But my point being is that grammar is a subject that you can learn. Euclidean geometry is a subject that you can learn.
Yeah, and you can also teach it a different way. We do a lot of grammar with our students because they learn Greek and they know English some. And the point of learning Greek, as with you probably in part, the point of learning
Arabic is to
Quranic
learn.
Arabic.
Yeah, part of it is to learn
is
grammar.
to discuss grammatical questions.
Right.
And most of matters which are taken didactically in grammar books can become dialectical in interesting discussions.
But those discussions are much better when the person has actually learned the subject. If they haven't learned the
Never
subject...
happens. You can wait from now until doomsday for our students to learn an actual subject in that way.
And well, that's why I think education is a lifelong thing.
Yeah.
I mean, Shakespeare, my father argued that Prospero was probably
Look, I don't want to be too absolute about this. There are certain things you simply have to take as facts and learn them. But it shouldn't the discussion shouldn't be postponed until you're too tired to engage in it. We start right away on the first day. They open their Euclid. Yeah? A point is that which has no parts.
Right.
Well, the discussion begins. What does a point have if it doesn't have any parts? What does it mean?
But you have to accept that axiom to do Euclidean geometry.
That's not even very clear because all the points they deal with will have parts since they use chalk. They have little parts.
Yeah.
And
Well,
this
it's
will
an
become a
abstraction.
subject
Yeah, and because, I mean, he's talking about something very abstract, and you're just giving a symbol of an abstraction.
Well, that's the question. The question is, which is the true representation? The one that is in your mind and invisible, and in which the point really might not have them, or the demonstration that you're giving on the blackboard. And why is it possible to give a demonstration of something, of a figure that clearly whose angles clearly don't add up to 180 degrees because they're all rounded and so on. And yet to point it and to say that this is what I've demonstrated when you've so clearly not demonstrated it, all these matters become subjects. But I'll give you a wonderful example of a mere fact, of a didactic fact.
Sure.
It is Clemenceau, the French
politician.
got into an argument with a German in which he was enforcing the notion that the Germans were wrong to invade Belgium. And the Germans said, well, it's a question of a point of view. And he said, are you arguing that on August 9th, I think, in 1914, the Belgians invaded Germany? And that was the end of that argument.
Right. It was a fact.
It was fact.
Yeah, but Clemenceau, it was a disaster.
That's
what
a
he
real
did.
fact.
Yeah. It would have been better had he just left it.
Well, that's a different.
Because we owe the Nazis to Clemenceau and what they did to the Germans after World War I. Let me just read a passage because I think this gets to the heart of a lot of what we're talking about. If men were angels, this is from Van Dorn.
This is Madison.
This is Van Dorn. If men were angels.
Who is it?
Van Dorn, Mark Van Dorn, from Liberal Education.
That's from.
He's
Federalist 10.
Yeah, but he's gonna.
Okay, I want to interrupt.
The opening is definitely. If men were angels, they could dispense with tradition. If they would know things all at once, and if they were animals, they would know things all at once, like angels. And if they were animals, they could do nicely with instinct as a substitute. Men must learn, and learn painfully, by accumulation and in time. The human tradition which collects this learning is more than history, and it is more than culture, as culture is currently conceived. It is the ideas that we have when we do not know we have them. It is the phoenix nest of language. It is the immortality in whose name education offers to secure the salvation of persons. It is what leaves novelty possible in science or in art, for it marks the end from which beginnings can be made. Without it, there can be no progress of any sort, and a civilization dies. Tradition is dangerous to the intellect which does not know how to love it, for it can weigh heavily upon weak heads. To accept it is to borrow trouble, for it heaves with controversies and unanswered questions. It has been said that to inherit the tradition of democracy is like inheriting a lawsuit. And this goes for tradition in general. But tradition is most dangerous and most troublesome when it is forgotten. It gives strength as well as takes it. It brings life as well as threatens it. It is life fighting to maintain itself in time. For there is the curious fact that tradition is never so healthy as when it is being fought. We deny its authority, but in doing so, we use its clearest terms and end, if we are original, in enriching it so that it may have strength for future wars. It is orthodoxy at its best, thriving on heresies which it digests into nobler problems. We return to tradition not for answers, but for questions, and some of those we find are capable, like live wires, of shocking us into a condition of dizziness or extreme heat. I think, for me, that passage, while I'm not totally in agreement with everything he says, but I think in religion, tradition is definitely inheriting a lawsuit, and for too many people, they don't see it as that way. There's a lot of things to grapple with in religion, and one of the debates, one of our great debates, was between al-Ghazali and Ibn Rushd. The Europeans they sided with Ibn Rushd and benefited greatly from him. That dialectic died out in the Muslim world, but I think it's an important dialectic for each generation, and that's why tradition has to constantly be revisited and re-engaged, and it shouldn't, if it's just accepted as dogma, it loses its power.
When you say tradition, do you mean scriptural tradition?
Well, here's the thing about our tradition, is that Scripture, if you learn the hermeneutic tools of interpretation, and you've learned them well, you can come up with multiple answers to the same Scripture. The Scripture itself generates questions. Yeah. And so this idea, I think the problem with the fundamentalists is that Scripture means one thing and only one thing to a fundamentalist.
But what I really meant is, do you mean written texts or do you mean practices? when you say tradition?
No, I think tradition to me has many different meanings. Religious tradition is one type of tradition. Customs and rites and rituals is another aspect of tradition. It's what's handed down, what was given to us. I mean, the thing that all of us are using is the language. We're speaking the language of Shakespeare.
Yeah.
I mean, it's been handed down to us for several hundred years.
See, I have to say, it would be interesting to me to hear what your thoughts about it are here in Zaytuna. But I think most of my colleagues would deny that we deal much in tradition. When we say the tradition, we usually mean the great books, which is not what tradition broadly should mean. But it doesn't mean
Well, in that they're
customs,
handed
practices,
down.
and so on.
I think in that they're handed down.
In that they're handed down, they are
a
part
tradition.
of the tradition.
Yeah. I mean, in the Arabic word is naqal, which literally means what's transmitted, what's given. And one of the things that you mentioned in here about one of the problems, we have a saying in Arabic, stop where they stopped and then proceed. Like you have to know the past, and this idea that, oh, I want to be original, and you don't know what's gone before you. So much, I mean, I saw something that just struck me in there. There was a quote from Aristotle about that it was very important for rulers to teach, that they have to teach the polity, inculcate in the young the polity that they're actually practicing. So if it's a tyranny, you want tyrannical schools. And then that's congruence theory. That's like a modern theory of Epstein. This idea that government government will only succeed to the degree with which the system of government is implemented in the other institutions in a society. And so, for instance,
that's the very meaning of totalitarianism.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think why totalitarianism exists in so many places is because of this loss of a liberal tradition, this idea of teaching people to think and being open to multiple possibilities.
Yeah, how can we disagree with that? Yes, it seems true to me. But I would not, see, as far as the program in a school is concerned, or at least at St. John's, I would not say that the transmission of a tradition is a great aim for us. When something happened is insignificant in our way of going at it. What is significant is what is always alive. In other words, nothing is, we would not want to put on the program something that was truly in the past, which means it's gone.
Right.
But only what is alive, and when it was actually produced is secondary.
Ezra Pound said a great book was News That Stayed News.
That's very nice, yeah.
I want to thank Dr. Brann for coming all this way. She flew out from the East Coast. She's on East Coast time, so out of deference to your time zone, we're on Pacific. We're actually on Muslim time out here, so it can get very late for us. But I want to really thank her for coming out and sharing with us her views. This is an ongoing discussion here, because I think these things are rediscovered. So what is a liberal education is not going to be a question that was answered tonight or anytime soon.
Yeah, and I would be very happy if we had some sort of way of talking to each other, even though it's across the continent.
Yeah.
And if any of you, either faculty or students, find yourself in Annapolis at some point, or in the area in Washington, you can give me a call, and you can come to the campus and maybe visit a class and meet some of the students, and they're very happy to meet other students. So
Great.
Thank you.
So thank you very much.
Thank you.